The first day I transmigrated into a neglected concubine in the cold palace. I was roasting sweet potatoes in the courtyard. The firewood crackled, and the charred scent mingled with the mustiness, typical of the cold palace, making my stomach growl. The former concubine Liu, that is, myself, had a rather unique reason for being sent here. In the imperial garden, the emperor's precious dog General Mighty was chasing a butterfly. My swing, where I was slacking off, happened to block its path. The beast couldn't brake in time and slammed headfirst into the swing's frame. With a yelp, a bump rose on its forehead. The emperor was absolutely heartbroken. Clutching the dog's head, he pointed at my nose and cursed, "You wicked woman! How dare you plot against my beloved dog?" Just like that, I went from Liu Qingyue, who had been in favor for 3 days, to simply Liu of the Cold Palace. I didn't even get a chance to defend myself. That dog of a man lives up to his name. Life in the Cold Palace is tougher than I imagined. 3 drafty rundown rooms, a stove that is falling apart, and rations. They don't exist. 2 meals a day, each consisting of a multi-grain bun hard as a rock, and a watery gruel so thin you can see your own reflection in the bowl, plus an elderly eunuch with glassy eyes and a shaky gait. Eunuch Fu is in charge of guarding me and delivering food. Every time he tosses the food box at the doorway, his gaze is just like looking at trash. "Mistress Liu, save your strength. Don't stir up trouble," is the most he ever says to me. Heh, don't stir up trouble. Should I just wait to starve to death in a place even rats avoid? I, a mechanical engineering nerd from an obscure 21st century university and a low-profile DIY enthusiast, am not about to take this lying down. I need to invent something. I must invent something to fill my stomach, to survive. I need to invent. The starting capital is the problem. In the Cold Palace, besides dust, cobwebs, and broken bricks, there is absolutely nothing. I stared at the pile of junk left behind by the previous tenants, gnawed to pieces by rats, my eyes lighting up. Tear it down. The legs of an old elm table, mortise and tenon joints, perfect as firewood. They burn long. The vanity with its peeling red lacquer. Pry the drawers out. The boards are nice and thick. Great materials. A stool missing half a leg, filled with dry bulrush on the inside. Gold. Found gold. Old Fu peeks through the crack in the door, his face full of terror. "Mistress Liu, are you tearing the house down? You mustn't. You really mustn't." "Old Fu. This is called resource recycling." I picked up half a brick, clanging it against the frame of the stool. "Relax. It won't collapse." He shook his head, sighed, and walked away, muttering to himself, "She is gone mad, truly gone mad." Invention number 1. Goal clearly defined. To solve the problem of eating, the earthen stove wastes too much wood, and the smoke is thick, bringing tears to my eyes. The main problem is its low efficiency. I set my sights on the only object in the yard that was still somewhat intact, a broken water crock about half a person's height. It had a large crack at the bottom, which is why it was abandoned here. The material, the thickness, isn't this just a ready-made thermal cooker shell? I heaved and rolled the crock to the corner sheltered from the wind. Using the broken bricks I'd pried loose, I built a simple base. I hoisted the crock onto it. There was no need to plug the crack at the bottom. It made a perfect air intake. The drawer boards I'd removed. I ground it with a stone I found, until it was a round lid of the perfect size. I chiseled a hole in the center of the lid and inserted a sanded-down table leg to serve as a chimney. Finally, using some dried yellow clay I dug up from a corner, mixed with well water, I plastered the cracks until they were completely sealed. A homemade stewing stove was complete. When Eunuch Fu arrived with the steamed buns and saw this dark, bulky thing in the corner, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. "What is this?" The stove god's new ride. An upgraded stove. I wiped the mud from my hands. No more choking on smoke from now on. Right in front of him, I stuffed a small amount of firewood into the bottom vent and lit it. I covered it with the lid, and the smoke obediently trailed out through the chimney. I dropped 2 hard buns into the vat, and an hour later, I lifted the lid. The buns had become soft and warm, with a faint smoky aroma. Eunuch Fu looked at the buns, then at my ride, and then at me. After a long pause, he finally squeezed out, "You've really got some skills." With basic hunger addressed, I began to pursue a better quality of life. The water in the Cold Palace was muddy and astringent. It was rough even on the face when washing. As for washing my hair or taking a bath, that was nothing but a luxury. My hair was so oily it could have been used to stir-fry vegetables, and my body itched so much I felt like scratching the walls. This was intolerable. My second invention was placed on the schedule. A water treatment system and a makeshift shower. That same old broken water vat continued to be put to good use. I covered the bottom of the vat with a thick thick layer of cleaned pebbles, then added a layer of crushed charcoal, which I had painstakingly selected from the remnants of burnt firewood. On top, I layered rinsed fine sand. A simple filtration system was ready. I poured the murky well water in, using a cracked clay pot at the bottom to catch it. The water flowing out was visibly clearer. I took a taste, though it still had a slight earthy tang. It was 100 times better than before. Eunuch Fu took a sip of the filtered water, smacked his lips. Incredible, Lady Liu. Did a deity teach you this? It is called science. I felt quite proud. With clean water, the shower was easy enough to manage. I found a sturdy tree fork at a higher point and hung another smaller broken clay pot from it. I drilled a small hole in the bottom of the pot and inserted a hollowed-out bamboo tube to act as a showerhead. I filled the pot with the filtered water, letting it sit in the sun for half the day until the water turned warm. I pulled up a scavenged, tattered sheet as a curtain, standing underneath it. I pulled out the cloth plug from the bamboo tube, and warm water cascaded down with a splash. Although the flow was thin, and it started and stopped intermittently, in this cold palace, it felt like a heavenly luxury. When I had my first hot shower, I nearly cried. I finally felt human again. Consort Chen, who arrived half a year before me, lived in the courtyard next door. She used to be a dancer and had a rather loud, brash personality. Across that low wall, she would often sigh loudly, complaining that the cold palace was no place for a person to live. Ever since I started my clanging and banging, her sighs had turned into all sorts of sour, biting mockery. "Oh, little sister Liu, are you tearing the place down? Isn't this cold palace broken enough already? Why drag in such a huge black vat? Making pickles? Splashing water? Say, sister, you aren't secretly crying in there, are you? Crying won't help. Save your strength." I was busy scrubbing my handmade soap and couldn't be bothered with her. Yes, my third invention, handmade soap. Hair and clothes don't get clean with just plain water. I needed a powerful cleaning agent. The materials, lard saved from cooking, which Eunuch Fu would occasionally give me extra when I was being well behaved, the fruit of the neglected honey locust tree growing in the corner of the cold palace, and lye water filtered from wood ash. Melt the lard. Crush the locust fruit to extract the juice. Slowly add the lye water and stir constantly. An indescribable odor began to permeate the small courtyard. Consort Chen's nose is sharper than a dog's. She immediately climbed up the wall. "Liu Qingyue, what kind of mess are you making now? This smell. Are you boiling waste?" I rolled my eyes at her. "Don't talk about what you don't understand. It is good stuff." She pinched her nose, looking completely disgusted. "With this smell, I wouldn't take it even if you gave it away for free." I poured the finished soap liquid into molds I'd fashioned from broken roof tiles. A few days later, I unmolded them, cutting them into yellowish, unsightly solid blocks. I couldn't wait to grab one, dissolve it in warm water, and found the lather was rich and creamy. Washing my hair, it felt incredibly fresh and smooth. Washing my hands, stubborn grime came right off. Scrubbing my clothes, the stains vanished before my eyes. The effect was outstanding. I was happily washing my hair, with lather all over my head, when I looked up and saw Consort Chen with half her body leaning over the wall. Her eyes were wide as brass bells, staring fixedly at the rich foam on my head and at the old clothes hanging nearby that were clearly much cleaner. That yellow lump," she said, her voice sounding a bit dry. "Can it really clean things?" I shook my foam-covered head at her. "Aha. You've seen the results for yourself." Consort Chen swallowed hard, her expression shifting unpredictably from shock to inner struggle before she finally put on an incredibly awkward smile. "Say, Sister Liu, you know, we're both sisters in misfortune. Cut it out." I wiped the foam off my face. "Want some?" She nodded vigorously. "Trade me for it." I pointed at the only piece of jewelry she had left that was still intact. A simple silver hairpin. "This, what?" Consort Chen covered the hairpin, acting as if she'd been stepped on. "This is the last thing I own of any value. Take it or leave it." I went back to slowly scrubbing my hair. "I've got plenty for myself anyway." Consort Chen looked at my clean hair, then at her own greasy, matted locks, and touched her own stiff, dirty clothes. She struggled with it for a full 15 minutes. "Fine, take it." She steeled herself, pulled out the hairpin, and tossed it over the wall. "Give me 2 bars. No, 3 bars. Deal." The first international trade of the Cold Palace was successfully completed, with Consort Chen as my walking advertisement. My Cold Palace brand handmade soap quickly opened up a market. The customers were mainly the other veteran residents of the Cold Palace. Beauty Wong traded an old, well-embroidered handkerchief she'd been keeping for 1 bar. Talented Lady Lai traded half a bag of white sugar she had hidden away for 2 bars. Even the errand girl, Xiao Tao, the one with the best ear for news, blushed deeply and traded a small bag of toasted pumpkin seeds to get one for herself. Seeing the growing pile of supplies in my little courtyard, the initial shock and suspicion in Eunuch Fu's eyes turned into something complex when he brought my meals. For the first time ever, he didn't just toss the food box on the ground, but placed it carefully on the relatively clean step. Mistress Liu, he hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. You ought to take it easy. You're making too much of a stir. What if word gets out? What if it does? I was busy tinkering with my latest project, a hand-cranked fan. I'm already in the cold palace. Where else could they possibly exile me? Eunuch Fu stared at my invention made of scrap bamboo, thin twine, and a reclaimed embroidery hoop, which was actually blowing a decent breeze. Opened his mouth, but ultimately said nothing. He just shook his head and walked away. However, the very next day, underneath the bowl of coarse-grained buns he delivered, there was secretly a small pile of pickled vegetables. Heh. Old man Fu, turns out, you're a softy at heart. Summer had arrived. The cold palace was like a giant steamer, so stifling it was hard to breathe. The mosquitoes, too, were out in swarms, buzzing around like bombers. My fourth invention, the mosquito repellent and soothing kit. Materials: the mugwort growing lush in the corner of the yard, mint, and a bit of cheap rice wine I traded from Xiao Tao. I dried the mugwort and mint, crushed them, and mixed them together. I stuffed some into sachets sewn from scrap fabric, and hung them by the bed and door. Some was soaked in the clear liquor to make a simple mosquito repellent. The remaining dregs were mixed with a bit of lard to create a greenish anti-itch balm. The effect was immediate. The scent of wormwood and mint filled the air, and the mosquitoes noticeably thinned out. When bitten, you'd apply the anti-itch balm. It felt cool and soothing, and the swelling and itching vanished in no time. Consort Chen was the first to catch the scent and rush over. This time, I didn't even have to ask. She proactively offered up a precious box of rouge she'd kept hidden away. Although the color was garish and startling, Liu Qingyue, help me. The mosquitoes are going to carry me away. The sachets, the repellent, the anti-itch balm. I want it all. Lady Wang and Lady Li also caught wind of it and hurried over. My cold palace convenience store was booming. Xiao Tao even became my top-tier agent, secretly taking my products out to sell to low-ranking maids and eunuchs, trading them for essentials like needles, thread, scraps of fabric, and salt. My life was visibly improving. Although I was still in the cold palace, I was well fed, occasionally even cooking up a little something extra. I was dressed cleanly with my fabric patchwork clothes looking quite presentable, and living comfortably. I had a fan, no mosquitoes, and was even starting to feel quite content with my exile. The only problem was, inventions require materials. The junk pile in the cold palace had been picked clean by me. There was nothing left to salvage. I needed to tap into new resources, and the opportunity arrived. Xiao Tao whispered to me conspiratorially that in a few days it would be the Ghost Festival, and every corner of the palace would be cleaned out, especially the abandoned nooks, where useless, old items would be cleared out and dumped at the remote waste yard behind the palace, to be gathered and hauled away to be burned. A dump? My eyes lit up instantly. What's in there? Everything. Xiao Tao counted off on her fingers. Broken lanterns, old window gauze, battered tables and chairs, and stuff they moved out of the old abandoned storage rooms. I heard there are even parts from broken Western clocks. Western clock parts. My heart skipped a beat. Those are real treasures. Xiao Tao, my happiness depends on you now. I grabbed her hands. On that day, you have to find a way to get some of that stuff for me, especially those parts. I'll make you a new sachet, a super deluxe version. Xiao Tao was dizzy from me shaking her, but when she heard super deluxe sachet, her eyes lit up too. Deal. Sister Liu, consider it done. 3 days after the Ghost Festival, Xiao Tao took advantage of the night and dragged a heavy, bulging burlap sack, huffing and puffing as she snuck into my courtyard. Sister Liu, hurry. Good stuff here. I excitedly opened the sack. Oh my. The broken, faded frames of palace lanterns, pieces of translucent old window gauze, even though they were a bit yellow, several thin wooden boards of various sizes, bundles of copper wire in different thicknesses. At the very bottom, inside a cardboard box, were several rusty gears and mainsprings, along with a few small magnets. Xiao Tao, you're a sister to me. I hugged the box of parts. I almost kissed it. Sis, do you think this is any use? Xiao Tao pulled another small cloth bag from her tunic. I opened it. Inside were several thin, shimmering metal wires. I saw how shiny they were, and they looked pretty cool, so I just swiped them. I picked them up to take a look. They were copper wires, and the purity was quite high. Useful. Incredibly useful. I was grinning from ear to ear after sending off a satisfied Xiao Tao, who was clutching her deluxe mosquito repellent and anti-itch set. I looked at this pile of junk, my eyes shining with excitement. New project commencing. My eyes were shining. New project commencing. This time, the goal is a bit ambitious. I want to see see if I can build a communication device. The cold palace is just too isolated. My only source of news is the occasional gossip Xiao Tao brings in. If something real ever happens outside, I'd be completely in the dark. It's too passive. Materials, gears, clockwork springs, magnets, copper wire, thin wooden boards, window gauze. A bold idea began to take shape in my mind. Build a model of the most primitive telegraph machine. The principle is simple. Use electromagnetic induction. Magnets, a coil, a closed circuit. It generates electricity, which drives a small mechanism to make a clicking sound. I don't need it to send signals over a long distance. As long as I can make it tap out a pattern, create a rhythmic sound. To prove the principle works, that would be a success. No sooner said than done. I carefully wrap the small magnets in window gauze and fixed them onto a disassembled embroidery hoop to serve as a rotor. Using the thinnest copper wire, I wound coils around a thin wooden board. Combining gears and a mainspring, I built a simple hand-cranked generator. Although the electricity generated was pathetically weak, the most troublesome part was the receiver. I used thin wooden boards to make a small stand, and hung a featherweight hammer made of gauze and bamboo strips. Underneath, I placed a thin piece of scrap iron, salvaged from a discarded lantern. The ideal state was for me to crank the generator, sending a weak current through the copper wire to the receiver's coil, creating a magnetic force to attract the hammer and strike the iron plate, making a clicking sound. But in practice, everything was a problem. The copper wire was too thin, and the connections would break at the slightest touch. The power generation was so weak it was nearly undetectable. The hammer was too light, blown away by even the slightest breeze. I fell into a frenzy of debugging. The courtyard was filled with all sorts of failed prototypes. My hair was a mess, my hands covered in oil and soot, with my eyes fixed only on that pile of scrap metal. When eunuch Fu brought my meal, seeing me in this state, he nearly dropped the food box in shock. Lady Liu, are you practicing alchemy? He looked at my contraption of tangled copper wires with a look of horror, as if this thing were not of this world. Consort Chen peered over the wall, looking deeply concerned. Liu Qingyue, have you gone off the deep end? Do you need me to find an imperial physician? She probably thought I was on the verge of madness. I didn't even look up. Don't disturb me. This is a critical stage. They have no idea. I'm so close to succeeding. Just a tiny bit more. One sweltering afternoon, the cicadas were screeching. I was crouched on the ground, trying to connect that damn copper wire for the 108th time. Sweat ran down my forehead and into my eyes, stinging and painful. My fingers, raw from hours of winding the copper wire, were throbbing. So frustrated, incredibly frustrated. You tyrant emperor. It is all your fault, I cursed viciously. If you hadn't been blind enough to dump me here, I wouldn't have to suffer like this. Snap. I lost control of my grip, and the copper wire I had finally connected broke again. I yanked at my hair in a frenzy, on the verge of a breakdown. Just then, crash. My already rickety cold palace gate was kicked open from the outside. Wood splinters flew everywhere. Blinding sunlight poured in, making me squint. Backlit, a tall figure stood blocking the doorway. In dragon robes and a golden crown, he exuded an overwhelming aura. Behind him were several guards with swords, and eunuch Fu trembling like a leaf and pale as a ghost. The air froze instantly. Even the cicadas stopped chirping. I remained crouched on the ground, one hand pulling my hair, the other clutching the broken copper wire. My face smeared with soot, staring dumbly at the entrance. Only one thought flashed through my mind. It is over. My alchemy furnace has been discovered. The man at the door was clearly just as shocked by the scene in the courtyard. His gaze swept over the black, smoldering stove in the corner, glided past the hanging handmade soap. His gaze swept over the black, smoldering stove in the corner, glided past the hanging handmade soap, and rested on the hand-cranked fan still slowly spinning. Finally, it locked onto the pile of junk before me, connected by copper wires, gears, and magnets. His brow knitted together bit by bit, his eyes as sharp as blades, especially when he saw the gleaming copper wire clutched in my hand. His face darkened instantly. Lady Liu, a cold voice, heavy with imperial authority, crashed down upon me. You have a lot of nerve. To think you would dare hide gold thread in the cold palace and practice such sorcery and curses. Gold thread, sorcery, and curses. I looked down at the broken copper wire in my hand, then at my pile of junk, and finally at his handsome, sullen face that looked like a thunderstorm. A surge of pure pure rage shot straight from my heels to my skull. Screw the Emperor, and screw his talk of sorcery. I have had enough. I stood up abruptly, past caring about status or etiquette anymore. Sorcery, curses. I held up that piece of broken copper wire, my voice trembling with agitation and fury. Your Majesty, could you please open your imperial eyes and look closely? This is damn copper wire. Brass, not gold. It's not worth a dime. I pointed at my pile of scrap. And this is called a scientific experiment. Do you understand? Science, not some shamanistic dance. The more I spoke, the angrier I became. The frustration of days of exhausting troubleshooting, the anger of being falsely accused. It all erupted at once. I'm here in this cold palace, without enough food or warm clothes. If I don't try to tinker with things myself, am I just supposed to wait to die? I improved the stove just to have a hot meal. I made soap to keep clean and avoid lice. I rigged up a fan to drive away mosquitoes, because it is hot enough in here to steam an egg, and the mosquitoes are thick enough to eat a person alive. Everything I've been doing is just so I can live. Somewhat like a human being in this hellhole. Whose path have I blocked? What law have I broken? I finished my outburst in one breath, my chest heaving violently. The courtyard was deathly silent. The guards had their hands gripped on their sword hilts. Eunuch Fu was so terrified he collapsed to the ground, his eyes rolling back. Over by the wall, concubine Chen had likely already fainted from fear. The old emperor, Xiao Jingyan, just stood there, watching me with an expressionless face. His gaze, which had been icy with initial rage, slowly became rather strange, as if he were seeing me for the first time, or perhaps trying to comprehend those strange words. Like scientific experiment that had just tumbled out of my rant. His silence lasted an agonizingly long time. Just when I thought that in the next second he would order this mad woman to be dragged out and beheaded, he moved. He took a step forward and walked into my small courtyard. His boots crunched on the scattered wood shavings and copper wire. He walked into my small courtyard. His boots crunched on the scattered wood shavings and copper wire, making a soft sound. He ignored the clutter and went straight to my hand-cranked fan, staring at the bamboo blades still spinning slowly. Then, he reached out a finger and poked it. The blades wobbled. He walked over to my thermal cooker, lifted the lid, and peered at the ashes remaining inside. Finally, his gaze fell upon my clothes, washed clean, and neatly patched with scraps of cloth hanging on the bamboo pole, along with the sachets of wormwood and mint hanging nearby. He picked up one of the sachets, held it to his nose, and took a sniff. His brow seemed to unfurl just a little. Then, he turned around, his sharp gaze locking onto me once more. He was holding that yellowish piece of handmade soap. That, he said, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion. What is it? I was taken aback and answered instinctively. Soap. For washing things. Washing what? Washing hands. Washing faces. Washing hair. Even washing clothes. It does it all. I couldn't quite get a read on what he was up to. He fell silent for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. Then, he did something that left everyone completely stunned. He reached out his hands toward me, his pampered, well-defined, and elegant fingers. Try it. I suspected I had misheard. Try what? Use it. His pampered, well-defined, and elegant fingers. Try it. I suspected I had misheard. Try what? Use it. He pointed to the soap in my hand. Wash. I looked at his outstretched hand, so clean it almost gleamed, then back at the unsightly and somewhat rough-looking handmade soap in my own hand, and looked again at his expressionless face. But in his eyes, there seemed to be a hint of scrutiny. Has this damn emperor lost his mind? Or was he stunned by my shouting? Your Majesty, I managed to stammer out. Your hands are already quite clean. There is really no need. I said, try it. His tone was flat, yet carried an air of unquestionable authority. Fine then. You're the emperor, you make the rules. I resignedly walked to the water jar, scooped up half a basin of filtered water, picked up that bar of handmade soap, and on the back of the hand he extended, gave it a vigorous scrub. The slick sensation made his brow furrow ever so slightly. Rub it, he commanded, succinct and sharp, biting the bullet. I took hold of his noble imperial hand, dampened it with a little water, and began to scrub. Fine white lather quickly covered the back of his hand. A faint scent, a mix of locust pod and wood ash, not exactly fragrant but clean and fresh, began to permeate the air. He lowered his gaze, watching the mounting foam on his hand, his expression as focused as if he were studying a rare treasure. After rubbing for about 10 seconds, rinse it, he commanded. I scooped up some clear water and slowly rinsed the foam off his hand. After rubbing for about 10 seconds, rinse it, he commanded. I scooped up some clear water and slowly rinsed the foam off his hand. Under the flowing water, that hand of his, which was already clean, now possessed a sheer, slightly radiant cleanliness. He raised his hand up to the sunlight, examining it from every angle. He then lifted it to his nose and took a sniff. No fragrance, only a pure, crisp scent of something freshly washed. He remained silent for a long time, long enough that my legs were beginning to go numb. Finally, he lowered his hand. His gaze settled on my face once more. His expression was complex and unreadable. This thing. He gestured toward the soap in my hand. Did you make it? Yes. What is it made of? Lard, soap locust, and wood ash water. I answered honestly. He seemed somewhat surprised. His brow twitched again. Then, his gaze swept over my pile of junk and finally rested upon the heap of gears and magnets. That pile of things. He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. What are those for? Here it comes. My heart jumped to my throat. How should I explain this? If I tell him I'm trying to build a primitive telegraph, will he think I've lost my mind? Or that I'm dabbling in witchcraft? I took a deep breath. I'll just have to go for it. Your Majesty, that is an experiment. What kind of experiment? An experiment to transmit information. I tried my best to use language he could understand, using magnets, copper wire, and electricity, using magnets, copper wire, and electricity, a kind of invisible force, to allow specific signals to be received far away. I rambled incoherently, feeling as though my own explanation sounded like a fairy tale. Just as I thought, his brows furrowed once again. His eyes were filled with suspicion, signals, and unseen force. He walked over to the pile of junk, leaning down. He picked up a magnet. Based on these, the theory is correct. I defended myself in a hurry. It is just that the materials are inadequate and the technology is limited, so it hasn't succeeded yet. He gripped that soot-black magnet, weighing it in his hand. Then he picked up a copper wire, twirling it between his fingers, and then he looked at me, his gaze burning like a torch. Liu Qingyue, your humble servant is here. My heart tightened. How long have you been in the cold palace? Your Majesty, 1 year and 3 months. I remembered it perfectly. In this 1 year and 3 months, his voice betrayed no emotion. You have been here in the cold palace, tinkering with these inventions? Yes. Why? I froze for a moment. To survive. To make myself more comfortable, to prove that I'm still of some use. I opened my mouth, but in the end, I just said dryly, I had time on my hands and wanted something to do. He stared at me, that gaze of his seemingly able to pierce through the soul. The courtyard fell back into a stifling silence. A breeze blew past. The courtyard fell back into a stifling silence. A breeze blew past. The bamboo blades of the hand-cranked fan creaked slightly. Just as the weight of the silence was about to crush me, he spoke suddenly. His voice was low, yet it struck like a pebble into stagnant water. Make one for me too. I suspected I was hallucinating. That fan. He pointed to the bamboo blades still spinning lazily, and that soap as well. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the laundry I had hanging out. Along with that jar of yours that purifies water, he added. Send them to the Chenyuan Palace. I was completely stunned, and it wasn't just me. Eunuch Fu collapsed on the ground, the guards at the gate, and Consort Chen peeking stealthily over the wall, were all turned to stone. The emperor himself comes to the cold palace, kicks the door open, sees a pile of witchcraft-looking junk, yells at me for a bit, and then places an order, with free delivery included no less. This turn of events, is it not a bit too surreal? Over the next few days, the cold palace was like being touched by a red-hot iron. It exploded with activity. Eunuch Fu stopped sighing altogether, walking with his back ramrod straight. When he brought meals, there was quietly an extra salted duck egg in the box. The way Consort Chen looked at me was filled with awe and fanaticism. She looked ready to climb the wall at any moment to become my apprentice. Xiao Tao became the busiest person of all, running back and forth to the cold palace. What she brought was no longer scraps, but high-quality lard, fine cotton fabric, and brand-new tools. And even a small jar of precious honey. Sister Liu, His Majesty has ordered. Only the best materials are to be used. Xiao Tao said, her face flushed with excitement. The chief of the Imperial Household Department selected these himself. I had become the most popular person in the Cold Palace. No, I was the busiest foreman in the Cold Palace. The Emperor has placed an order. This is no joking matter. I took Eunuch Fu with me, as he insisted on helping out. His eyes were gleaming, along with Consort Chen, who shamelessly crowded in to watch and learn. We began our Cold Palace weapons production. The fans needed an upgrade. We used the high-quality fine bamboo strips that were sent over, sanding them down until smooth. The gear structure was redesigned, making them easier to crank, and the airflow stronger. The frames were reinforced with sturdy hardwood. The soap had to be refined, filtered, then filtered again. A touch of honey and mint juice was added to improve the texture and fragrance. Using new cotton cloth, I cut them into uniform squares and wrapped them carefully. The water filter tank required extra attention attention, cleaned and sterilized inside and out, layered with the fine white quartz sand and activated carbon that were sent, supposedly perfected by the Ministry of Works artisans. The filtering efficiency was boosted by several notches. I even included a manual for a simplified shower device. After all, the emperor can't keep hanging clay pots on trees to bathe. Working overtime. 3 days later, we had a set of upgraded hand-cranked fans, a dozen premium honey mint soaps, and a luxurious water filtration shower system with detailed installation and operation instructions, plus several large bags of mosquito repellent sachets and anti-itch ointment. Everything was packed and ready. The chief of the Imperial Household Department arrived in person, and with great reverence he and his men carried it all away. Eunuch Fu looked at the empty courtyard, wiped the sweat from his brow, and exclaimed, "I've lived for so many years, but this is the first time I've ever seen someone send such things to the emperor." Consort Chen rummaged through the leftover scraps, her eyes shining. "Liu Qingyue, next time the emperor wants something, take me with you. I'll be your apprentice. I won't even ask for pay." I collapsed exhausted onto the only chair that was still in one piece. "I'm feeling a bit nervous. The stuff has been sent over, but what is the result? Is that tyrant happy? He wouldn't pick a fight and have me beheaded, right?" I waited anxiously for a few days, but the decree to have my head chopped off never came. Instead, I got some explosive gossip from Xiao Tao. "Sister Liu, it is exploded. The Qianyuan Palace is in an uproar." Xiao Tao rushed in, too excited to speak clearly. "His Majesty used that shower you sent, and I heard he spent a full hour in there. When he came out, his hair was still wet, and the look on his face was, well, he looked so refreshed. And that fan. His Majesty has a young eunuch crank it for him while he reviews documents. He says it is even more comfortable than an ice basin, and it saves ice. And that soap. Everyone working in the Qianyuan Palace has their own little bar now. Head eunuch Wang is washing his hands constantly. He brags to everyone about how clean his hands are. The best part is the sachets. His Majesty had several hung all around the dragon bed. They say he's sleeping like a baby." Xiao Tao's eyes were sparkling. "Sister Liu, you are the best." She gave me a thumbs up. I let out a sigh of relief, unable to contain a little bit of pride. "You tyrant. I guess you know what I'm capable of now, don't you?" Before I could finish feeling smug, Eunuch Fu came jogging in, looking all mysterious. "Mistress Liu, this is wonderful news. The Ministry of Works. People from the Ministry of Works are here. They say they are acting on His Majesty's orders to invite you to the Ministry of Works workshop to provide guidance on your water purification jar and the fans manufacturing process." "What? The Ministry of Works. They want me to provide guidance." I'm a little dizzy. Isn't this a bit of a leap? From a discarded concubine in the cold palace to a technical consultant for the Ministry of Works, standing in the ministry's spacious and bright workshop, surrounded by all the tools and a mountain of materials, staring at a group of officials and craftsmen in official robes, some white-haired and elderly, some in their prime, their eyes filled with curiosity and scrutiny, and a hint of something barely noticeable, wondering if this woman actually knew her stuff. I felt a bit dazed. The lead ministry official was named Fang, a thin, sharp-eyed old man. His manner was very polite, but his tone carried the rigor of a technician. "Lady Liu, His Majesty is quite impressed with the water purification device and the fan you improved. Might you show us the intricacies behind them? Especially the water purification process. How exactly is it achieved?" I steadied myself. "Sure. Isn't this just a technical exchange? When I was inventing things, you all were still struggling with basic joinery." I rolled up my sleeves, which was a bit unladylike in these robes, but I couldn't care less about that now. I walked over to the prepared materials. "Lord Fang, please take a look." I picked up the filtration material. The key is layered filtration. Coarse gravel goes at the very bottom to catch large particulate matter. In the middle, we use charcoal to absorb odors and fine suspended solids, and the top layer is fine sand for further filtering. I explained as I worked, demonstrating how to set up the layers. "You also need to pay attention to the flow direction. It should ideally be a slow percolation. For the fan, the key is the gear ratio and the angle of the blades." I kept my explanation simple and clear, using language they could easily understand, and even sketched out diagrams from time to time. At the very beginning, those officials and craftsmen were still looking on with a critical eye. Gradually, their expressions changed. Some began to nod along. Some took out small notebooks and scribbled away. Some couldn't help but ask questions. "Mistress Liu, why must the charcoal be made from hardwood? Won't pine charcoal work? Hardwood charcoal has a more stable structure, provides stronger absorption, and doesn't crumble into powder easily. And as for the angle of the fan blades, is bigger always better? Not necessarily. You must consider the concentration of airflow and the balance of resistance. The atmosphere in the workshop grew increasingly enthusiastic. From water purification and fans, we moved on to improving the drainage ditches, using the principle of gravity-fed flow, and how to use scrap wood to press more durable composite boards. The fragmented knowledge from my modern life was being ignited in this environment, sparking new ideas. The way Vice Minister Fang looked at me shifted from his initial politeness to genuine admiration and respect. Mistress Liu has great talent, he exclaimed with heartfelt sincerity. These ideas seem simple, yet they align with the fundamental laws of nature. They truly open one's eyes. By the end of the technical guidance, everyone was thoroughly pleased. As I was leaving, Vice Minister Fang personally saw me to the door and even gifted me a set of high-quality carpentry tools. Mistress Liu, if you ever have any brilliant ideas in the future or require any materials, just send someone to the Ministry of Works workshop to let us know, he promised solemnly. Returning to the cold palace, I felt as if I were walking on clouds. The Vice Minister of Works gave me tools and invited me back to advise them anytime. This world is so surreal, but the even more surreal part was yet to come. The next day, the Emperor's reward has arrived. It wasn't just a sneaky extra salted duck egg this time, but a formal, long procession brought in by the head of the Imperial Household Department. Fine silks and satins, 4 bolts of each color, gold and silver ingots, a small case of them, fashionable palace hairpins, a box, a set of premium brushes, ink paper and inkstone, a complete set, and a whole new set of delicate tools suitable for a lady, including small saws, planes, carving knives, rulers, and even a tiny hand drill. The head of the Imperial Household Department beamed like a flower. Lady Liu, His Majesty's decree. Lady Liu is wise and clear-hearted. Her ingenuity is meritorious and truly excellent. We bestow these items to support your research. When he said the word research, his expression was a bit subtle. I looked at that pile of glittering rewards, especially that set of tools I'd been dreaming of, my heart pounding in my chest. What is that dog Emperor Xiao Jingyan playing at? Does he acknowledge my inventions? And is he encouraging me to keep at it? Eunuch Fu was so moved he wept. My lady, you finally made it. Consort Chen's eyes turned green with envy, circling that bolt of water-red cloud brocade. Liu Qingyue, if you strike it rich, don't forget about me. Life seemed different now. The cold palace was still the cold palace, but the doors weren't kept quite as tightly shut. The cold palace was still the cold palace, but the doors weren't kept quite as tightly shut. The food brought to us was upgraded from coarse grain buns to white flour buns, and occasionally there was even a bit of meat. Xiao Tao became my personal shopper, taking the small amount of silver I scraped from my rewards, or items bartered from the Ministry of Works, helping me scout for all sorts of odd materials. My focus for inventions shifted too. From the initial goal of basic survival, I started turning toward things that were, well, more interesting. For instance, using high-resilience ox tendons and bamboo. I tried building a toy crossbow with better range and better accuracy purely because I was bored. For instance, using scrap glass shards and copper tubing to tinker with a simple telescope. For instance, trying to make ice with saltpeter. My courtyard had become a laboratory for gadgets in the cold palace. Grandpa Fu became my lead assistant and safety consultant, mostly to keep me from setting the house on fire. Consort Chen became my top apprentice and product tester, trying out various failed prototypes and providing feedback in the form of shrill screams. Even Xiao Tao became half a materials expert, knowing the value and quality of all the strange materials on the market. The cold palace was more lively and full of life than ever before. Another month of peaceful, busy days drifted by. That evening, I had just finished fine-tuning my second-generation hand-cranked fan with added variable speed gears, allowing for adjustable wind speeds. I was physically exhausted. Xiao Tao rushed in, looking a bit pale. Sister Liu, it is bad. What is wrong? Tell me slowly. The Northern Frontier. An 800-mile emergency military report from the Northern Frontier. Xiao Tao lowered her voice choked with tears. I heard we suffered a defeat and lost so many men. His Majesty was furious in the Imperial study and knocked over the memorial cases. The Northern Frontier. A defeat. My heart skipped a beat, although I was locked deep within the palace. But I know what the war in the north means for the Dian dynasty. It is our protective barrier, and it cannot be allowed to fail. Do you know any specific details? I asked instinctively. How would I know the specifics? Xiao Tao shook her head. I only heard that they apparently fell into an ambush. The messaging was too slow, and reinforcements didn't arrive in time. In any case, it is bad news. The atmosphere in the palace has changed. Everyone is in a panic. The messaging was too slow. My heart skipped a beat. A thought struck my mind like a bolt of lightning. That pile of junk of mine, which the Emperor mistook for witchcraft. That failed primitive telegraph prototype, although it was just a piece of garbage that couldn't even produce a clicking sound. The principles behind it. In this age that relies on fast horses and signal fires to send information, if one could achieve even short-distance point-to-point signal transmission, in this age that relies on fast horses and signal fires to send information, if one could achieve even short-distance point-to-point signal transmission, I stood up abruptly and rushed to the corner of the room, digging out that dust-covered cardboard box. The rusty gears, mainspring magnets, and those few thin copper wires lay quietly in the box. My heart, however, began to race. A thought, bold to the point of madness, was growing wildly in my mind. Grandpa Fu. I turned back suddenly, my voice filled with an urgency I hadn't realized. I am here, mistress. Grandpa Fu was startled by me. Help me deliver a message. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. Tell them that Liu Qingyue requests an audience with the Emperor. Grandpa Fu's eyes widened instantly, as if he had seen a ghost. Mistress, you want to see the Emperor? Now? Yes, right now. Tell him. I looked at the magnet and copper wire in my hands. I have a way to relay the military reports from the northern frontier. The Imperial study. The atmosphere was so heavy you could cut it with a knife. The air was thick with stifling anger and agitation. Xiao Jingyan sat behind the massive dragon desk, his expression grim, bloodshot eyes betraying his fatigue. The desk was piled high with messy reports, and several high-ranking officials stood with heads bowed, hardly daring to breathe. Eunuch Fu, hunched over, knelt trembling on the floor, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Lady Liu says, regarding the northern frontier military reports, she has a way. Dead silence. You could hear a pin drop. The officials looked up abruptly, staring at Eunuch Fu, as if he had lost his mind. An abandoned consort from the cold palace, claiming she could solve a military communication crisis that even the fastest couriers couldn't handle. What kind of ridiculous joke was this? Xiao Jingyan's gaze, like a cold blade, slowly settled on Eunuch Fu. What did you say? His voice was low, yet it made the temperature in the study drop 10 degrees. Eunuch Fu was so scared he nearly collapsed to the floor. Your servant, Lady Liu says. Tell her to get in here. Xiao Jingyan's voice was heavy with suppressed fire. Soon, I was brought in, wearing a worn-out palace gown, my hair tied back simply, with dust from the workshop still smudged on my face. In my hands, I clutched that cardboard box tightly. This appearance clashed sharply with the solemnity of the imperial study. The looks from the officials were filled with undisguised shock, disdain, and disbelief. Lady Liu. Xiao Jingyan stared at me. His gaze was as sharp as an eagle's. Do you know what the penalty is for meddling in affairs of state? I dropped to my knees with a thud, not out of fear, but because my legs felt weak. Your Majesty. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I would not dare to meddle, Your Majesty. I dropped to my knees with a thud, not out of fear, but because my legs felt weak. Your Majesty. I looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I would not dare to meddle, Your Majesty. I merely have something that might deliver messages more quickly. Something. His eyes fell upon the box in my arms. His brow furrowed. You mean that pile of junk of yours? Yes. I nodded forcefully, casting all caution aside. Your Majesty, do you recall? Back in the cold palace, that pile of scrap you saw, the one you called witchcraft. Xiao Jingyan's expression flickered slightly. It was not witchcraft. It was meant to be a device for signaling, using the principles of magnets, coils, and currents. Enough. An elderly official with a white beard couldn't help but rebuke me. He was likely the Minister of War, deceiving the masses with sorcery, magnets, and currents. I have never heard of such a thing. The military situation is critical. How dare you spout such nonsense here? Your Majesty, another general said in a deep voice. This woman has clearly lost her mind. She must be removed at once. Voices of doubt rose from all sides. I bit my lip, my hands trembling as I clutched the box. Xiao Jingyan did not speak immediately. He looked at me, his gaze heavy, seemingly evaluating, weighing his options. Only oppressive breathing filled the imperial study. Finally, he spoke, His tone betrayed no emotion. This a little faster you speak of. How fast can it be? Faster than the swiftest horse. Countless times over. I replied firmly. This a little faster you speak of. How fast can it be? Faster than the swiftest horse. Countless times over. I replied firmly. In the blink of an eye. Absurd. The Minister of War was so angry his beard bristled. Xiao Jingyan raised a hand, silencing the old minister's rebuke. He stared at me. Liu Qingyue, do you know the punishment for deceiving the emperor? If I have uttered even a single falsehood, I am willing to face death. I met his gaze, unflinching. Another suffocating silence followed. Very well. Xiao Jingyan stood up slowly. He walked over to me, his tall frame casting a heavy sense of pressure. I will give you one chance. Right here. And right now, use the junk in your box. He pointed to the empty floor of the study. Demonstrate it for me. If you succeed, I shall grant you a great reward. But if you fail, he said with an icy glare, I will punish all your crimes together, without mercy. My heart leaped into my throat, and my palms were slick with sweat. Your Majesty, I require a few things. My voice sounded a bit parched. Speak. Fine copper wire. The thinner the better. The longer the better. Enough to wrap around this imperial study a few times. And also thin iron sheets and dry batteries. I stumbled. How do I explain a battery? Copper wire and iron sheets. The Ministry of Works warehouse has them. Vice Minister Fang had appeared summoned at some point. He stepped forward immediately. His eyes burned as he looked at me. Lady Liu, what else do you need? Just name it. I will have it done immediately. He seemed to be betting heavily on me. I also need sour fruit or vinegar. The sourer, the better. And salt. And zinc plates. Copper plates. Or iron nails and copper coins will work too. I had no choice but to treat a dead horse as if it were alive, attempting to make a primitive battery in the crudest way possible. Go prepare these at once. Xiao Jingyan ordered sharply. The entire imperial study burst into motion. Vice Minister Fang personally led men sprinting toward the Ministry of Works. Attendants scrambled to find sour fruit, vinegar, and salt. I knelt on the floor, opening the box with lightning speed. Taking out the gears and magnets, I began rewinding the coils, assembling the main body of that crude telegraph. Several high-ranking officials stood around. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with distrust and mocking curiosity. Xiao Jingyan stood right next to me, looking down at me as I clumsily operated the device. Time ticked away second by second. The materials arrived one after another. The thin copper wire, like a spider's web, was being rapidly strung across the floors and pillars of the study under Vice Minister Fang's direction. I placed the positive copper coins and the negative iron nails into the porcelain bowls, filled with the electrolyte mixture of strong vinegar and salt. I connect the battery to my transmitter with copper wire, and finally, I set the receiver stand with the hanging hammer. On the other side of the room, it looks outrageously crude. My hands are trembling, no matter how sound the theory is. Practice is always a different matter, with so many eyes watching, and the Emperor's looming threat of multiple punishments hanging over me. I take a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Everything hinges on this. I crouch before my transmitter and grip the hand crank firmly. My heart is pounding as if it might break through my chest. I crank the handle with all my might. Creak. Creak. The worn-out gears emit a harsh screeching sound. A weak electrical current travels through the copper wire and is transmitted instantly. Everyone's gaze is locked onto the receiver across the room. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The little hammer made of window gauze and thin bamboo on the stand remains completely motionless. Dead silence. Despair begins to spread. The Minister of War lets out a cold snort. Xiao Jingyan's expression turns completely frigid just as he is about to speak. Zet. At the coil of the receiver, a faint flickering spark seems to flash and vanish, immediately following the light, dangling hammer, ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly to the naked eye, jerks downward, clang, an extremely faint, yet clearly audible crisp sound. It struck the thin metal sheet below, though the sound was faint. In the pin-drop silence of the imperial study, it hit like a thunderclap. It moved. Vice Minister Fang was the first to cry out, his face flushed with excitement, his finger trembling as he pointed at the receiver. It rang. It actually rang. Another younger official exclaimed as well. The Minister of War and the General widened their eyes in an instant, mouths agape, as if turned to stone. Xiao Jingyan's pupils contracted sharply. He lunged forward a step, nearly pressing his face against the receiver. Try it again. His voice held a hint of barely perceptible tension. Gritting my teeth, I cranked the handle hard once more. Creak. Snap, clang, another sound. Though faint, it was clear and unmistakable. It really can ring. The general muttered to himself, his face filled with disbelief. Xiao Jingyan straightened up, slowly turning his head. His gaze was no longer cold or scrutinizing, but filled with shock, curiosity, and the burning light of one discovering a new world. He stared intensely at me, his voice low and powerful. Liu Qingyue, tell us, what exactly is this thing? And how can it transmit even further?